My unfaithful wife threatened to leave me after what she did, but I didn't care anymore and told her if she walks out that door, she should never set foot in this house again. Hey everyone, my name is Tyler, and I've been living in Miami for the past few years now. It's been a good life here, the kind of life most people would probably envy from the outside. But sometimes the picture-perfect exterior can hide the cracks that are slowly forming underneath. That evening started like so many others had recently. I was sitting in our living room, not really paying attention to much of anything, when I heard my wife Brielle come into the hallway. I didn't even need to look up to know it was her. There are certain sounds you become attuned to after years of marriage. But the first thing that hit me wasn't the sound of her footsteps. It was that expensive perfume she wore. The one she only seemed to put on when she wanted to feel noticed, when she was going somewhere that mattered to her. She didn't speak right away, which had become typical lately. Instead, I could hear the deliberate click of her heels against the hardwood floor. Click, click, each step measured and almost theatrical, like she was performing for an invisible audience. I could picture her without even looking, pausing by the hallway mirror, adjusting the strap of what I knew would be her burgundy dress, checking her lipstick one final time to make sure everything was perfect. When she finally spoke, it sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced the words 1,000 times before delivering them. "I'm heading out this evening," she announced, her voice carrying that casual tone people use when they're trying to make something significant sound mundane. I didn't even flinch at her words, though my hand was resting on the side of the couch, clenched so hard that my fingernails were digging into the fabric. Without lifting my eyes from whatever I was pretending to focus on, I replied as calmly as I could manage. "If you walk out that door, don't bother returning." The silence that followed wasn't the kind that invites questions or second thoughts. It was the kind of silence that confirms everything you've been trying not to admit for months, maybe longer. It was heavy with the weight of unspoken truths and decisions that had already been made long before this moment. She stood still for what felt like an eternity, but I knew it wasn't because she was conflicted about her choice. She wanted to make sure I saw it, saw her walk away, saw her choose someone else over me, over us, over everything we had built together. It was important to her that I witnessed this moment, that I understood exactly what was happening. Then, without another word, she left. There was no, "We'll talk later," no, "Don't be dramatic," no attempt to soften the blow or leave the door open for reconciliation. Just the sound of the front door unlocking, the familiar creak of the hinges, and then the definitive click as it closed behind her. The ease with which she walked away made my stomach twist into knots. I didn't move for a long time after that. I just sat there staring at the door, part of me still hoping against hope that it might swing back open. Maybe she would come back and say it was all a joke, that she loved me, that she was sorry for whatever game she was playing. But that door stayed closed, and deep down, I think I knew it always would. The house fell into an oppressive quiet after she left, broken only by the low hum of the refrigerator and a persistent buzzing that had started in my head. It was the kind of buzz that begins when your mind refuses to accept what it already knows to be true. That she had been slipping away from me for a while now, that the lies had stopped being clever or convincing, and that I wasn't going crazy like I'd sometimes wondered. I was just being ignored, dismissed, treated like I was invisible in my own marriage. Eventually, I forced myself to stand up and walk to the kitchen. I didn't bother turning on the lights. The darkness felt more honest somehow. I opened the cabinet and reached for the same bottle of bourbon that I hadn't touched in 4 years. We had quit drinking together back then, made a pact that we would grow up and make better choices for our future. I guess that promise had expired along with everything else we'd once promised each other. As I took that first burning sip, I pulled out my phone. Not to text her. I already knew she wouldn't be answering anything from me tonight. Instead, I opened the camera app and scrolled through the feeds. We had security cameras all over the house for safety, she had said when we installed them. The irony wasn't lost on me now. What she didn't know was that I had upgraded the system a few weeks back, adding an indoor camera near the hallway window. I hadn't told her about it, but then again, I didn't have to. She had stopped asking about anything that didn't serve her directly, stopped showing interest in the practical details of our shared life. I rewound the footage from 3 nights ago, and there it was. The evidence I hadn't wanted to find but knew I would. A car had pulled up outside our house, one I didn't recognize. It was a black Honda with tinted windows, and at exactly 10:15 p.m., she had walked out our front door and gotten in without so much as a glance back at the home we shared. The driver didn't get out to greet her or open her door. I paused the video, zoomed in, and enhanced the image as much as the system would allow. I couldn't make out his face clearly, but the shape and silhouette told me enough. He was tall, athletic, confident, everything that projected the kind of presence that apparently appealed to my wife more than I did. What made my jaw lock tight with a mixture of rage and humiliation was what happened next. They didn't drive off immediately like people in a hurry might. Instead, they sat there for a full minute, and I could see her head leaning against his shoulder in a gesture so casual and intimate that it was clear this wasn't their first time together. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a mistake or a drunken slip-up born from a moment of weakness. This was a routine, something polished and practiced. They had done this before, probably many times. I was looking at evidence of a relationship, not an affair. I set the phone down and walked upstairs to our bedroom, each step feeling heavier than the last. The room was still warm with the scent she had left behind, a mixture of her hair products, that expensive perfume, and the coconut lotion she swore by and applied religiously every morning. It was suffocating, like being wrapped in the ghost of someone who was already gone. I looked at our bed, made perfectly by her that morning as it always was. The covers were pulled tight, pillows fluffed and arranged with precision. It looked too perfect, like she was trying to erase any trace of her real life, any evidence of the messy human emotions that might have once existed in this space. Everything was sterile, controlled, calculated. I opened her dresser drawer, not out of some wild impulse, but with the quiet, methodical purpose of a man who needed to know everything before making his next move. Inside, I found exactly what I was looking for and exactly what I had hoped I wouldn't find. There were letters, receipts from restaurants I'd never been to, and tucked beneath everything else, a hotel keycard. Room 318, Ocean View Hotel. The plastic card sat in my palm like a small piece of evidence from a crime scene. What made it even more cruel was that it wasn't even hidden. She hadn't made any effort to conceal it, hadn't bothered to throw it away or tuck it somewhere I'd never think to look. It was just sitting there among her everyday items like it belonged there, like it was part of her normal routine. That's when I understood the cruelest part of all this. She didn't care if I found out. In fact, I was beginning to suspect she wanted me to find it. She was daring me to discover her secret life, challenging me to confront her about it. Maybe she was tired of living a double life, or maybe she just wanted to see if I still cared enough to fight for what we had. I stood there staring at that keycard, feeling something fundamental crack inside me. It wasn't rage, wasn't sorrow, wasn't even the sharp pain of betrayal I had expected. It was finality. A cold, clear understanding that this marriage was already over and had been for longer than I'd wanted to admit. She hadn't walked out on us tonight when she left for her date. She had ended us long ago, probably the first time she'd checked into room 318. Tonight was just the first time I'd been forced to see it for what it really was. I didn't sleep that night. The hours dragged by endlessly, and the house felt like it was suffocating me with memories. Every corner held some remnant of her presence. Her laugh that used to echo down the stairs when she was genuinely happy, her coffee mug still sitting in the sink from that morning, the half-folded laundry draped over the arm of the couch like she might come back and finish the task as if nothing had ever happened. I walked past these pieces of our shared life like I was touring a crime scene, waiting for something to make sense, for some detail to click into place and explain how we had gotten to this point. But nothing did. The ordinary objects just sat there, mocking me with their normalcy while my world crumbled around them. Around 2:45 a.m., I heard the familiar sound of her car pulling into our driveway. I didn't move from where I sat at the kitchen table, the hotel keycard still clutched in my hand like evidence I was planning to present at trial. I listened as her key clicked in the lock like nothing had changed, like this was just another normal evening ending in our normal life. The front door opened and closed with that same casual ease, followed by her footsteps, light, quick, and completely careless. She had no idea I was awake, no idea I was sitting there in the darkness waiting for her return. What struck me most was that I could hear her humming as she kicked off her shoes in the entryway. It was the same tune she used to sing when we made breakfast together on weekend mornings. Back when we were happy. Back when those moments belonged to us. Now it felt like she was humming someone else's song, like even that small piece of our history had been repurposed for her new life. I waited until she was halfway up the stairs before I finally spoke. "How was your evening?" My voice cut through the quiet house like a blade. The sound of her heels stopped cold against the wooden steps. She didn't say anything for a long, tense second, and I could practically hear her mind racing, trying to decide which version of herself to present to me now that she'd been caught. Then I heard her take a slow, deliberate breath, and her voice floated down to me, practiced and artificially sweet. "Don't start this right now. It's late." I stood up and walked into the hallway where she could see me clearly. The look that crossed her face was quick, a flickering moment of panic that she buried almost immediately. She smoothed her hair back and tilted her head slightly, rearranging her features into an expression that suggested I was the one being unreasonable, that I was the problem in this scenario. "You lied," I said simply, letting the words hang in the air between us. "About what?" she snapped back, the response coming too quickly, too defensively. "Where I went. You seriously think you have the right to interrogate me like I'm your child?" That's when I held up the hotel keycard, letting her see exactly what I'd found. Room 318 Ocean View. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at the piece of plastic in my hand, but she didn't flinch. She didn't apologize or try to explain it away. Instead, she crossed her arms like this was some minor inconvenience she didn't have time to deal with, like I was bothering her with trivial complaints about her day. "That's what this is about," she said coldly, her voice dripping with disdain. "So you went through my things? Wow, creepy." I couldn't help but laugh, a short, sharp sound that had nothing to do with humor. The sheer absurdity of her response was breathtaking. It was like watching a snake try to blame the rabbit for getting bitten, like she genuinely believed she could twist this situation to make me the villain. "I watched you get into his car, Brielle," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "He didn't even have to ring the bell. You just walked out like I didn't exist, like we never existed." "Don't be dramatic," she replied with a dismissive wave of her hand. "You've been distant for months. You barely touch me. We haven't had a real conversation in forever." "You didn't try to talk to me," I fired back, feeling my composure starting to crack. "You didn't say anything about being unhappy. You just left, again and again." She shrugged, and that casual gesture cut deeper than any angry words could have. What would I even say? "You're not the man I married anymore." That one stung, but not because it was true. It hurt because it wasn't true at all. I had changed, yes, but not in the way she was suggesting. I had changed because she had changed first, and I had spent the last year desperately trying to hold something together while she played pretend at home and lived an entirely different life behind my back. I stepped closer to her, needing to see her face clearly when I asked the question that would either confirm my worst fears or give me some small reason to hope. "How long, Brielle?" She rolled her eyes like I was asking her about the weather. "Does it matter?" "Yes, it matters." There was a pause that seemed to stretch on forever. She looked me dead in the eye, and when she spoke, her voice was flat and emotionless, like she was reading items off a grocery list. 8 months. 8 months. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my legs go weak, but I forced myself to stay upright. My throat tightened, and my fists began trembling as the full weight of what she just admitted sank in. 8 months of lies. 8 months of her leaving the house with a kiss on my cheek, acting like a loving wife while she was actually living a double life. 8 months of me questioning my own intuition, wondering if I was going crazy, if I was imagining things that weren't there. And she just stood there, completely unapologetic, like admitting to almost a year of betrayal was nothing more than a chore she had to endure. Like explaining herself to me was an inconvenience rather than the least she could do after destroying our marriage. That time frame would have put the beginning of her affair right after our anniversary. While I was still believing we had a future together, she was already planning her exit strategy with someone else. "You said if I walked out that door I shouldn't come back," she said after a beat, her voice carrying a challenge. "So why are we still talking?" I stared at her, completely stunned by her audacity. That's when it finally hit me with perfect clarity. She was already gone. The version of her that I had fallen in love with. The woman who once danced barefoot in our kitchen at midnight, who laughed until she cried watching dumb sitcoms with me curled up on the couch. That person didn't exist anymore. Maybe she never had. This woman standing in front of me didn't even try to hide the fact that she didn't love me. She wasn't ashamed of what she'd done, wasn't sorry for the pain she'd caused. She was annoyed that I'd found out and was making her deal with the consequences of her choices. I didn't answer her question. I couldn't. Instead, I just stepped back, turned around, and walked away from her. I went upstairs to the guest room. My room now, I realized, and locked the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I let myself cry. But I wasn't crying because I had lost her. I was crying because I finally understood that I had been fighting desperately to keep someone who had been sprinting away from me for months. I had been pouring my heart into trying to save a marriage that she had already ended without bothering to tell me. Tomorrow I would call a lawyer and start the process of officially ending what had already been over for 8 months. But tonight, I just let myself grieve for the man I used to be. The one who still believed his wife loved him. The one who thought their problems could be solved with better communication and more effort. That man was gone now, and honestly, it was probably for the best. I didn't speak to her the entire next day. The silence between us was deliberate on my part. I had nothing left to say to her, and more importantly, I refused to give her another stage to perform on. She moved around the house like nothing had happened, like the previous night's confrontation had been nothing more than a minor disagreement about what to watch on television. I could hear her playing music in the bathroom while she showered, the same upbeat songs she always listened to when she was in a good mood. Later, she ordered food from that Chinese place she knew I liked, as if lo mein could somehow mop up the destruction she had dumped in the middle of our lives. It was almost impressive, her ability to compartmentalize and pretend that everything was normal. I stayed upstairs with the door locked, my back pressed against the frame like I was barricading myself from something worse than an intruder. At some point in the afternoon, she knocked on the door once. She didn't say anything, just that single knock, followed by silence. I didn't answer. Wouldn't give her the satisfaction of acknowledging her presence, or the opportunity to manipulate the situation further. Later that evening, I finally ventured downstairs to get some water, thinking she might have gone out again. Instead, I found her lounging on the couch, painting her nails a deep red color while the television played some reality show featuring women screaming at each other. She was actually laughing at whatever drama was unfolding on screen, genuinely entertained, like her own world hadn't cracked wide open just hours before. Like mine hadn't completely imploded the night before. She glanced up at me as I walked through the living room, and the casual way she looked at me made my blood run cold. "You're being a little dramatic, don't you think?" she said, blowing on her freshly painted nails. I stopped and stared at her, waiting for some sign that she understood the gravity of what had happened between us. But she didn't flinch, didn't show any recognition of the pain she'd caused. She just returned her attention to the television screen like I was an annoying interruption to her evening routine. "I told you," she added with a shrug, not even bothering to look at me this time. "We've been falling apart for a long time. You're acting like this is some huge betrayal when really, you checked out way before I did." My jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth might crack. The audacity of her trying to rewrite our history, to make herself the victim in this scenario, was breathtaking in its cruelty. "Don't try to rewrite the story, Brielle," I said, my voice tight with controlled anger. She sat up on the couch, crossing her legs and tilting her head at me like I was some toddler throwing a tantrum over not getting my way. The condescending look in her eyes made me want to scream. "You think you've been perfect?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Sitting in your little work bubble, zoning out every night like I don't even exist? God forbid someone else makes me feel wanted." I took a step forward, feeling something dangerous building in my chest. "So that's your defense? I wasn't affectionate enough, so you climbed into someone else's bed?" "No," she said flatly, her mask finally slipping to reveal the cold calculation underneath. "I climbed into someone else's life, because at least he didn't make me feel invisible." There it was, the truth, plain and bitter. Not an apology, not an explanation, but a justification. In her mind, my perceived failings as a husband had given her permission to destroy our marriage. She had taken my emotional distance and used it as a license for betrayal. I wanted to scream, wanted to throw something, wanted to break something just to match the destruction I felt inside. But I didn't. I just stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs, every second ticking by louder than the last, each one marking time in a conversation that was ending our marriage. "You didn't even try to fix anything," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't say you were unhappy. You didn't ask for space or counseling or anything. You just decided I wasn't good enough and found someone else to replace me." She smirked, and that expression was like a knife to the chest. "I didn't find him. He found me. And he made me realize I didn't have to settle for living with a stranger." I felt something twist inside me, something fundamental breaking apart. The woman I had married would never have said those words, would never have looked at me with such casual cruelty. This person sitting in front of me was someone else entirely. "Leave," I said, the word coming out harder than I intended. "Go be with him. Stop pretending like you're stuck here." Her expression shifted, and for just a moment, I saw that flicker of fear again. Not because she cared about me or our marriage, but because she was realizing she might actually have to follow through on her threats. Her little game of having two lives might actually end with real consequences. "I can't just leave," she said, and for the first time all day, her voice wavered slightly. "It's not that simple." "Sure it is," I replied, finding my strength again. "Pack your things. I'll sleep in the guest room until the papers are finalized. You can stay with him if you need to, or check into room 318 again. I'm sure the staff remembers you by now." Her eyes narrowed at my mention of the hotel, clearly displeased that I knew more details about her secret life than she had anticipated. When she spoke again, her voice dropped into a venomous whisper, and I finally saw the real person she had become underneath all the pretense. "You think you're the victim here? You're not," she hissed. "You were always distant, cold, boring. He actually listens to me, makes me feel alive. I don't owe you anything." I couldn't help but laugh, not out of humor, but out of sheer disbelief at what I was hearing. The woman I had married, the one I had built a life with, was sitting there telling me that my personality flaws had justified her betrayal. That somehow, my being boring had given her the right to destroy our marriage. "You're right," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my head. "You don't owe me anything anymore. Just honesty, and even that's clearly too expensive for you." She stood up abruptly, her sudden movement knocking over the bottle of nail polish she'd been using. The red liquid spilled across our coffee table like a tiny crime scene, spreading in a dark stain that seemed oddly symbolic of what she'd done to our life together. She didn't bother to clean it up, didn't even glance at the mess she'd made. She just stormed upstairs and slammed the bedroom door with enough force to rattle the windows. I stayed there in the living room, staring at that overturned bottle spinning slowly on its side, watching the red polish continue to spread across the wood. That's when I realized with perfect clarity that she didn't just want to end our marriage, she wanted to burn everything down. Not just the trust, not just the love we'd once shared, but all of it. The memories, the home we'd built, the life we'd created together. She wanted to leave nothing but ashes behind. I reached for my phone and opened the email thread with a divorce attorney I had saved weeks ago, but never had the courage to contact. My fingers moved almost automatically as I typed the first sentence. "My wife has been unfaithful, and I'm ready to move forward." I clicked send before I could second-guess myself. This wasn't heartbreak anymore. This was clarity. For the first time in months, I knew exactly what I needed to do, and I was finally ready to do it. 2 days passed without a single word between us. We moved through the house like opposing ghosts, never crossing paths for more than a few seconds at a time. I had started timing my movements around hers. If I heard her in the kitchen, I stayed in the office. If she was on the stairs, I waited until her footsteps faded before I dared to move. It wasn't about maintaining peace anymore. It was about survival, about containing the damage until I could figure out my next steps. But on the third day, everything exploded in a way I never could have anticipated. I was in the garage, digging through a box of old documents, our marriage license, car titles, health insurance files, tax returns. I needed to be thorough and precise in gathering everything my lawyer would need. I didn't want to leave any room for her to twist the narrative later or claim I was hiding assets. Every piece of paper felt like evidence in a case I was building against my own life. That's when I heard it. The front door swinging open, followed by voices. Plural. Her laugh cut through the air first, that light, flirty sound she hadn't used with me in over a year. It was followed by a man's voice, deeper and more confident than I had expected. My blood turned to ice in my veins as the realization hit me. She had brought him here, to our home, to the place where we had built our life together. I froze, my hands buried in a stack of folders, not even breathing. I stepped back into the house slowly, moving through the laundry room and staying low, though I wasn't even sure why. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe it was just the need to confirm this final thread of betrayal that I had still hoped she wouldn't pull. And there he was, standing in our kitchen wearing my house slippers like he owned the place. He looked younger than I had expected, late 20s maybe, with the kind of gym-sculpted body and carefully maintained stubble that made him look like he'd just stepped out of an Instagram advertisement. He was leaning against our counter with the casual confidence of someone who had done this before, like this was part of his regular routine. Brielle was pouring 2 glasses of wine, our wine, from our cabinet, and she was talking loud enough for me to hear every word. "He's probably holed up in that sad little office," she said with a cruel laugh. "He's been such a pathetic mess lately." The man chuckled, and the sound made my stomach turn. "He still doesn't know who I am, right? Please," she scoffed, her voice dripping with contempt. He wouldn't recognize a red flag if it slapped him in the face. I could walk in with a sign that says I'm cheating and he'd ask if I wanted coffee. They both laughed at that, and I stood in the hallway with my heart thundering in my ears. But I wasn't shocked anymore. I was sharpened, like something inside me had finally clicked into place after months of confusion and self-doubt. I stepped into the kitchen, and the effect was immediate. Her wine glass froze midway to her lips, and his hand dropped from her waist like it had caught fire. Brielle's eyes went wide, her lips parting in surprise as she realized she'd been caught red-handed. "What are you doing?" she asked, as if I was the one who was out of place in my own home. I looked at him first. This stranger who had been mocking me in my own kitchen while wearing my slippers. "Get out," I said simply. He hesitated for a moment, then had the audacity to smirk at me. "Look, man, I wasn't asking," I interrupted, my voice carrying a finality that cut through whatever excuse he was about to offer. He glanced at Brielle like he expected her to protect him, to jump to his defense and tell me I had no right to throw him out. But she didn't. She actually took a step back, distancing herself from him, and that was all the confirmation I needed about where her loyalties really lay. When push came to shove, she was going to save herself first. He grabbed his keys from our counter and walked past me toward the door, brushing against me like I was nothing more than air, like I was an obstacle to step around rather than the homeowner whose space he'd invaded. I shut the door behind him quietly, taking a moment to compose myself before turning back to face her. "Seriously?" I asked, my voice heavy with disbelief. "You couldn't even wait for the ink to dry on the divorce papers?" Her arms were crossed defensively, her jaw clenched in that way it got when she knew she was wrong but refused to admit it. "You told me to leave. You told me it was over. That doesn't mean you get to bring your side piece into my house," I shot back. "Our house," she corrected, emphasizing the word like it gave her some kind of legal right to disrespect me in my own home. I stepped forward, feeling my patience finally reach its breaking point. "Not anymore." She looked away, her jaw tightening as she realized the implications of what I was saying. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, she seemed to understand that there would be real consequences for her actions. "I didn't think you'd be here," she said, and there was something almost pathetic in the way she said it, like that somehow made what she'd done acceptable. "That's the problem, Brielle," I replied. "You don't think. You just do whatever you want and assume I'll clean up the mess afterward." She flinched at that, and I knew I'd hit something true. That's exactly what she'd been doing, living her life without considering how her choices affected anyone else, especially me. "You think I wanted this?" She snapped suddenly, her voice rising with a desperation I hadn't heard from her before. "You think I wanted to sneak around, to lie? I tried, Tyler. I tried to get your attention, to get you to care. But you were already gone." "You didn't try," I said, my own voice rising to match hers. "You bailed quietly, selfishly. And when I started to notice, you turned it into my fault." She stared at me, blinking hard, but I noticed there were no tears, no real regret in her eyes. Just friction. Just the anger of someone who'd been caught and didn't like having to explain herself. "We're done," I said with finality. "This is the last time you ever disrespect me in this house." She nodded once, a sharp, bitter movement. "Fine." She walked upstairs slowly and deliberately, as if she was dragging the weight of a dozen lies behind her with every step. I stood in the kitchen, in the exact spot where we had toasted our anniversary just last year, watching the glass of wine she'd left behind still swirling on the counter from where she'd set it down in her panic. That's when I realized with perfect clarity that this hadn't just been a broken marriage. It had been a performance, an elaborate show where she'd been playing the role of a loving wife while living an entirely different life. And I had been the only one who didn't know it was all an act, the only one who thought what we had was real. The next morning, the house was empty. Her car was gone from the driveway, and with it, the suffocating presence I had grown accustomed to avoiding. There was no note, no phone call, no explanation. She was just gone, like she had evaporated into thin air. I stood in the living room with my coffee growing cold in my hand, staring at the last little remnants of her presence. Her phone charger was still plugged into the wall by the couch. A single gold earring sat on the hallway table, glinting in the morning light like she had dropped it on purpose. Like a final breadcrumb left behind to remind me that she could still haunt me, even when she wasn't physically there. I didn't ask where she had gone. I didn't care. That day, I sent all the documentation to my attorney, and the divorce filing was clean and factual. I didn't add any unnecessary bitterness or demands for revenge. I just requested clarity, a clear path out of this mess. I asked for the house, my car, and to be left alone to rebuild my life without her interference. In the afternoon, I started boxing her things. It wasn't out of spite or anger, it was pure necessity. I couldn't take another morning of brushing past her designer shoes in the closet, or catching sight of her yoga mat rolled up in the corner of the bedroom, sitting there like she might come back any moment and unroll it as if nothing had ever happened. The boxes filled faster than I had expected. Clothes, makeup, old letters from friends, her framed college degree, the matching his and hers coffee mugs we had bought on that trip to Savannah 3 years ago when we still believed we had a future together. I didn't break anything, didn't scream at the memories, didn't throw her belongings around in a fit of rage. I just packed it all away in methodical silence, treating each item like evidence that needed to be carefully cataloged and removed. Around 6 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text message. Her name appeared on the screen. "Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time, my thumbs hovering over the keyboard as I considered my options. Part of me wanted to ignore her completely, to let her wonder whether I'd even seen her message. Another part of me wanted to tell her to go straight to hell and never contact me again. But something deeper in me needed to hear whatever she had to say, to hear the final few nails being hammered into the coffin of our marriage. I typed back, "Where?" Her response came quickly. "Here, I'm 10 minutes away." I didn't respond to that. 10 minutes turned into 12, and then she was walking through our front door again. But this time was different. She wasn't wearing any makeup, her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was dressed in a hoodie and jeans, a version of her I hadn't seen in years. This was the woman from before she had turned into someone who weaponized attention and got drunk on validation from strangers. She walked in slowly, like a stranger trying to re-enter someone else's life, uncertain of her welcome or her place in this space that had once been hers too. "Hey," she said quietly, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in months. I nodded in acknowledgement but didn't offer her a seat or fake a smile. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. She glanced at the boxes stacked near the wall, and I saw something flicker across her face. Surprise, maybe. Or the first real recognition that this was actually happening. "So that's it?" she asked, gesturing toward the cardboard containers that held the remnants of her life in this house. "You walked out," I said, keeping my voice level and factual. "You brought him into our home. What did you think was going to happen?" She bit her lip and started pacing around the living room, her movements restless and agitated. I didn't expect it to feel like this. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely curious about what she could possibly mean. "Like what?" "Final," she said, the word coming out like a confession she hadn't meant to make. I couldn't help but laugh once. A sharp, humorless sound that cut through the tension in the room. "You thought I'd chase you? After everything you've done? I thought we'd at least talk," she muttered, avoiding my eyes as she continued her nervous pacing. "I thought maybe you'd ask me to stay or fight for what we had." That broke something in me, something that had been holding together by sheer willpower alone. The sheer audacity of her expectations was breathtaking. "You don't cheat on someone for 8 months and then ask them to fight for you, Brielle. You already chose your side." She stopped pacing and looked me straight in the eye for the first time since she'd walked in. "I'm not in love with him," she said, like this was some kind of revelation that should change everything. I didn't blink, didn't react with surprise or hope. "I know," I said simply. "You're not in love with anyone, not even yourself." She winced like she wanted to be angry at my words, but there was nothing left in her arsenal to throw at me. The silence stretched between us, raw and wide, filled with all the things we'd never said and now never would. "I lost myself somewhere," she said finally, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I don't know who I am anymore." "That's not my problem to fix," I replied, and I meant every word. She stepped forward, moving closer to me with something that looked almost like desperation. "Do you really want to end it like this?" I looked at her for a long time, studying this person who had once been the center of my world. This wasn't the woman I had married, the one who used to dance barefoot on our back porch and cry during Pixar movies. That woman had been capable of genuine emotion, of real connection, of love that didn't come with conditions and betrayals. This woman standing in front of me had lied without flinching, had slept in our bed while living another life, had brought a stranger into our kitchen and mocked me in my own home. This wasn't someone asking if our marriage was really over. This was someone who wanted to know if I still cared enough to make it hard for her to leave. "Yes," I said, and the word came out with more certainty than I'd felt about anything in months. She nodded, and I could see her lips trembling slightly, but there were no tears. She never gave me that, not even now when everything was ending. Even in this moment that should have been raw and honest, she was still holding something back, still performing some version of herself rather than just being real with me. "I'll come get the rest of my stuff tomorrow," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor I'd seen on her face. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. She walked toward the door slowly this time, her steps deliberate and measured, like she was waiting for something to stop her. Maybe she was hoping I'd call her name, ask her to stay, tell her we could work through this somehow. But nothing came. I just watched her go, and for the first time in months, the air in the house felt clean when the door closed behind her. I didn't hear from her the next day. No phone call, no text message, no knock at the door to collect her belongings. So I boxed up the rest of her things anyway, methodically clearing out every trace of her presence from what was now just my home. I cleaned out the bathroom drawers, finding half-empty skincare bottles, a hair straightener with a piece of her hair still caught in it, and tucked under the sink, an old receipt from a spa with a name I didn't recognize written in the guest column. Every time I tossed something into one of the cardboard boxes, it felt less like grief and more like shedding skin. Not all pain comes in dramatic waves, I realized. Sometimes it peels off slow and steady, ugly at first, but ultimately leaving you cleaner than you were before. Around 3 p.m., the doorbell rang. I opened it to find her standing there, but this version of her was different again. She was dressed better than she had been the night before. Her makeup was done just enough to show she cared what I thought, but not so much that it suggested she was broken or desperate. Behind her, a silver SUV idled in the street with a different driver than the black Honda I'd seen in the security footage. Same pattern, different car. She glanced at the stack of boxes I'd left inside the doorway, visible through the open door. "So that's it," she said, nodding toward them. It wasn't really a question. I didn't answer. I just leaned against the doorframe and waited to see what she'd come to say. She looked past me into the house, her eyes scanning the space like she missed it, like she thought she could somehow will herself back into the life she'd abandoned. "I didn't think it would hit me like this," she said, and there was something almost genuine in her voice for the first time in ages. I leaned against the doorframe, studying her face. "You've said that before." She didn't like that response. Her jaw tightened, and I could see the frustration building behind her carefully applied makeup. "I made a mistake," she said, like this was some grand revelation that should change everything between us. "You made several," I said calmly, not giving her the emotional reaction she was clearly fishing for. "I was hurting too," she snapped, her composure finally cracking. "You act like I just woke up and decided to cheat. But I was miserable, Tyler. We were strangers living in the same house. I tried to talk to you and you always pushed it off, always buried yourself in your work, your screens, whatever was more important than me." "I didn't cheat on you," I said simply. "No," she said bitterly, her voice taking on that sharp edge I'd grown to recognize. "You just let me rot." That one stung, but I didn't react visibly. I had done my share of reflection over these past few days, and she wasn't entirely wrong about some things. We had drifted apart. I had turned inward, stopped engaging with her the way I used to. But marriage isn't a game of assigning blame like children fighting over who started what. You don't fix emotional distance with betrayal. You talk, you fight if you have to, you show up and do the work. You don't just disappear into someone else's bed and pretend it's justified. "You didn't rot," I said quietly. "You slipped away. And when I started reaching out, when I began to notice something was wrong, you hid everything behind lies and made me feel like I was going crazy." She looked down at her feet, then back up at me with something that might have been vulnerability if I hadn't learned not to trust her expressions. "Do you still love me?" There it was. The real question she'd come here to ask. Not, "Are you okay?" Or "Can we fix this?" Or even, "I'm sorry for what I've done to you." Just that. "Do you still love me?" The answer sat on my tongue like a bitter pill that I'd been forced to swallow. "I loved who you were," I said finally, choosing my words carefully. "But I don't even recognize you anymore." She closed her eyes for just a second, a long blink like she was trying to hold something back that threatened to spill over. "I thought I was in control," she said quietly. "Like I could handle it, keep both lives going without anyone getting hurt. I didn't mean for it to get this far." "That's what makes it worse," I replied. "You thought it was yours to control, like I was just background noise in your personal drama." Silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. She stepped inside without asking permission and grabbed one of the boxes, lifting it with both arms like she was reclaiming a piece of her former life. I let her do it, watching as she carried it back to the silver SUV where her driver waited. He didn't get out to help her. Didn't even acknowledge her struggle with the weight of the box. She came back for a second box, then paused at the doorway like she was gathering courage for one final attempt. "Do you think we'll ever talk again?" she asked, her voice smaller than I'd heard it since this whole nightmare began. I stared at her, trying to find something to hold on to in her face, some remnant of the girl who had once danced with me in the rain outside our first apartment. I searched for any trace of the woman who used to wake me up with coffee and terrible jokes, who cried at commercials and made elaborate plans for our future together. But I couldn't find her anywhere in the person standing before me. "No," I said simply. She nodded like she had already known what my answer would be, like she'd been preparing herself for this final rejection. Then, just before she turned to leave, she looked at me with something that resembled genuine sorrow for the first time since this all began. "I hope he breaks your heart," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. But I wasn't saying it out of anger or spite. It was more like a warning, a prediction based on what I'd learned about her character. "So you'll finally understand what you've done to me." She blinked, clearly stunned by my words. Her mouth opened slightly like she wanted to respond, but nothing came out. She just stood there for a moment, processing what I'd said, and perhaps recognizing the truth in it. Then she turned and walked away, carrying the last piece of her belongings in a cardboard box toward the car where another man waited to drive her to whatever came next in her life. She didn't look back at me or the house we'd shared. Didn't offer any final words of apology or regret. I watched her load that final box into the SUV and get in the passenger seat. As they drove away, I realized I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Relief. Not the bitter satisfaction of revenge, but the clean, quiet relief of finally being free from the constant tension of living with someone who had been lying to me every single day. It had been 5 days since she took the last of her things from the house. The silence that followed was different from the tense quiet we'd lived in during those final weeks together. This was cleaner somehow, more honest. There was no clatter of her makeup bottles in the bathroom, no humming while she folded laundry, no fake laughter from her endless scroll through influencer videos on the couch. I hated how my brain still reached for those sounds sometimes, like echoes trying to find their source. But they were gone. She was gone. And every day that passed, the anger I'd been carrying started to evolve. It wasn't disappearing entirely, but it was changing from something white-hot and consuming into something colder and more focused. I had stopped checking my phone expecting to see her name pop up with some excuse or explanation. I didn't wonder who she was with or whether she was texting him while thinking about our conversation. I simply didn't care anymore, and that indifference felt like a victory in itself. I was working late in my home office when my email chimed with a new message. The subject line read, "Re-Property Division. Urgent addendum," and it was from Brielle's lawyer's firm. The email itself was short and to the point, but its contents made my blood run cold. She wanted the house, not just a share of its value or some negotiated settlement. She was requesting full rights to it in the final divorce filing. The same house I had been paying the mortgage on since the day we closed on it. The house I had renovated with my own hands. The house where her lover had sat wearing my slippers like he owned the place. I stared at the screen, stunned for a moment before the frustration rose up like a tidal wave. This wasn't really about the house, I realized. This was about control, about taking the one last piece of solid ground I had left to stand on. This was her final attempt to assert power in a situation where she'd already lost everything that mattered. I called my lawyer immediately. "No," I said, before he could even finish his greeting. "She doesn't get the house. She forfeited any claim to it when she moved out and brought someone else into it before the divorce was even filed." He agreed with my position, but the fury I felt didn't settle. A few hours later, my phone buzzed with a text from her. "Hey, can we meet? I want to explain before this gets uglier than it has to." I didn't want to meet with her again. Every interaction we'd recently had left me feeling drained and manipulated. But something in me still needed to understand what she thought she was doing. What possible justification she could have for this latest move. I told her to meet me at a neutral place, a public cafe downtown where neither of us had any memories together, where there were no emotional landmines hiding under the tables and chairs, waiting to explode in our faces. She showed up 12 minutes late, dressed in a tight black blazer and heels like she was heading to a client meeting rather than discussing the slow-motion wreckage of our marriage. This was the PR version of Brielle, polished and professional. Ready to present her case like this was just another business transaction she needed to close. She sat down across from me and crossed her legs with deliberate precision. "You got the email?" she asked, cutting straight to the point without any pretense of small talk. I nodded. You want the house? She tilted her head and smiled, but it was thin and calculated, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed. Well, technically I'm entitled to part of it. I contributed to our life there. You contributed lies and hotel receipts, I said flatly. Her practiced smile faltered slightly, replaced by a frown that suggested I was being unreasonable. Let's not make this personal. It is personal, I snapped, feeling my carefully controlled composure starting to crack. You think you can walk out, completely destroy our relationship, sleep with someone else for 8 months, and then come back and try to cut out a bigger piece of what's left? Her face twitched with irritation, like I was a difficult client who wasn't responding to her sales pitch the way she'd expected. You really think you're some kind of saint in all this? No, I said, meeting her gaze directly. I think I'm the one who didn't cheat. I think I'm the one who didn't invite another man into our home and parade him around like a trophy. That silenced her completely. She leaned back in her chair and exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated that her usual manipulation tactics weren't working on me anymore. I didn't come here to fight, she said after a moment, trying to regain control of the conversation. Then what did you come for? I asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied my face like she was looking for some crack in my resolve, some weakness she could exploit. When she finally spoke, her words cut through me like a blade. I thought you'd fold, she said with brutal honesty. You always do. I thought you'd cave and say, fine, take it, just go away and leave me alone. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I truly saw her for who she really was. Not the wife I had married, not the girl who used to hold my hand in bed and whisper her dreams before we fell asleep. This was the real Brielle, the one who had been hiding underneath the charm and performance and just enough calculated softness to keep me circling the drain. I'm not that man anymore, I said quietly, and I meant every word. She smiled, but it was thin and hollow, like a mask that was starting to slip. We'll see, she said, with the confidence of someone who believed she still held all the cards. Then she stood up without touching the coffee she'd ordered, gathering her purse and walking out like the conversation had gone exactly as she'd expected it to. But this time, she was wrong. I wasn't folding, wasn't caving to her demands just to make the pain stop faster. 4 days after that cafe meeting, her carefully constructed facade finally cracked completely. It started with a phone call from her lawyer, calm, professional, almost apologetic in tone. They were apparently reevaluating their approach to the property division. Brielle was having a change of heart about pursuing full ownership of the house. Translation: she knew she was losing, and she was smart enough to recognize when her bluff had been called. I didn't celebrate or feel victorious. I just felt resolute. Every step forward now wasn't about revenge or getting back at her for what she'd done. It was about finally closing a door that I should have locked months ago when the first red flags started appearing. That same evening, just as the sun was dipping low enough to cast long, cold shadows across the front lawn, she showed up at my door again. There was no text this time warning me she was coming. Just the familiar sound of tires against the gravel driveway and the doorbell ringing twice in quick succession. I opened the door to find Brielle standing there with wet eyes, but these weren't the full sobbing, mascara-running theatrics I might have expected. No, these were sharp, deliberate tears, held like weapons she hoped might still have some power over me. I shouldn't have pushed for the house, she said softly, her voice carrying a vulnerability that I hadn't heard from her in months. I said nothing, just stood there waiting to see what performance she was going to give me this time. I got scared, she continued, wrapping her arms around herself in a gesture that was probably calculated to make her appear small and fragile. I don't know who I am outside of all this. Then you need to find out, I said simply. But not here. She stepped forward slightly, moving closer to me like proximity alone might somehow bridge the vast distance that now existed between us. Do you ever think about how it used to be? When it was good? I didn't answer immediately. The truth was, I did think about the early days sometimes. But those memories were starting to feel less like facts and more like stories I'd invented to survive her indifference. The good times had existed, certainly, but they had always been outnumbered by the slow erosion that came after. The gradual way she'd withdrawn her love and attention until I was left grasping at shadows. She took my silence as something else entirely, misreading my lack of response as an opening for her to continue her appeal. I was stupid, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I messed it all up. I thought I wanted more excitement, passion, whatever, but it wasn't real. And yet you brought him into our home, I said, my voice steady and factual. Into our kitchen. You stood in front of me and defended it like I was the one who had broken something. Her lips parted and a shaky breath escaped before she could stop it. I wanted to hurt you, she admitted, and those words hung in the air between us like a confession she hadn't meant to make. That was the most honest thing she'd said to me in months, maybe longer. Finally, a moment of real truth instead of carefully crafted explanations and justifications. Because you felt hurt? I asked, genuinely wanting to understand her twisted logic. She nodded, and for a moment she looked like a child caught in a lie, small and ashamed. So, instead of talking, instead of trying to work through whatever problems we had, you chose destruction, I said. You decided that hurting me was more important than fixing anything. I didn't know what else to do, she said. But even as the words left her mouth, they sounded hollow and inadequate. No, I corrected her. You didn't care what else to do. There's a difference. Her eyes dropped to the porch floor beneath her feet. I'm in therapy now, she said quietly, like this information might somehow change the equation between us. Good, I said simply. Keep going. She looked up at me then, and there was something unfamiliar in her expression. Desperation, yes, but also a quiet flicker of realization. Like she was finally beginning to see just how far she had fallen from the person she once pretended to be, how completely she had destroyed not just our marriage, but her own sense of self in the process. I still love you, she whispered. And those 3 words should have meant something, should have carried weight and possibility. But they didn't. No, Brielle, I replied without hesitation. You miss the version of me that tolerated this. You miss the man who covered for your messes and believed your lies and made excuses for your behavior. But you don't love me? You never did. You loved having me as a safety net while you explored other options. She flinched like I had physically struck her, taking a small step backward as the truth of my words hit her. So that's it? She asked, her voice barely audible. It's been it for a long time, I said. You ended this marriage 8 months ago. I'm just finally catching up to reality. She stood there for a moment longer, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. Maybe she was hoping I would waver, that I would see the cracks in her facade and mistake them for genuine softness or remorse. But I didn't. I couldn't. I had learned too much about who she really was underneath all the performance to be fooled again. You'll regret this, she said quietly, and there was something almost threatening in the way she said it. Maybe, I replied with complete honesty, but I'll finally be able to look in the mirror and recognize myself again. She turned and walked back to her car slower this time, like her body weighed more with every step she took away from me. She didn't look back, didn't offer any final words or gestures. I didn't watch her drive away either. That night, I stood in the kitchen where she had once laughed and lied with equal ease. I poured myself a drink and let the silence wash over everything in the house. But it wasn't the oppressive, suffocating silence we'd lived with during those final weeks together. This was different, not empty, just quiet. Clean, honest. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't dared to hope for. Peace. It was cold and clean and absolutely final, like the first breath of air after being underwater for too long. The court date came quicker than I had expected. It was a gray morning with just enough rain to blur the windows, but not enough to truly soak through anything. The kind of weather that makes everything feel like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to change. I arrived early, wearing the same suit I had worn to our engagement party years ago. It seemed strangely appropriate somehow, the way things circle back on themselves when you're not paying attention. She arrived 7 minutes late, and I watched her through the glass doors of the courthouse. She was standing under a black umbrella, flanked by her attorney, looking sharp and professional. Her hair was pulled back tight, and her expression was calm, but her eyes gave her away. They darted and shifted, looking anywhere except directly at me. In the courtroom, we didn't speak to each other. We sat on opposite sides of the room, surrounded by cold faces and stacks of paperwork that represented the legal dismantling of 7 years of shared life. When the judge asked if the terms had been finalized, my lawyer stood and confirmed that yes, everything had been agreed upon. No alimony, no house for her, no fight over furniture or bank accounts. Just a clean break, exactly what I had asked for from the beginning. She signed the documents without hesitation. I could see her hand tremble slightly as she wrote her name, but she didn't ask for a moment to reconsider, didn't pause to think about what she was doing. She just signed like she couldn't wait for it to be over. Then it was my turn. I signed the papers in complete silence, my pen moving across the documents with steady, deliberate strokes. And just like that, it was over. 7 years of marriage, of shared dreams and broken promises, of love and betrayal, all of it reduced to ink on legal paper. Afterward, I walked out of the courthouse alone. The rain had stopped, but everything still smelled like the aftermath of a storm, clean and fresh, like the world had been washed and was ready to start over. I took the long way to the parking garage, deliberately walking past some of the same streets we had once strolled hand in hand after dinners, after fights, after late-night conversations about our future together when we still believed we had one. She texted me later that evening, and seeing her name pop up on my phone felt surreal after everything that had happened. "I know it's final now," the first message read. "I just want to say I'm sorry for how I handled everything," came the second. "For the pain I caused," was the third. I stared at those messages for a long time, reading them over and over again. They felt too little and too late, but they also felt genuine in a way that most of her recent communications hadn't. Maybe the finality of the divorce had stripped away some of her defenses, made her confront what she had actually done. I typed back, "I know." Then, after a moment of consideration, "I hope you figure yourself out." That was all. No anger, no bitterness, no long paragraph explaining how much she had hurt me or listing all the ways she had failed as a wife. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life being haunted by her damage. Wasn't going to let her take another ounce of energy from me that could be better spent building something new. In the weeks that followed, I started piecing together a new rhythm for my life. I changed the locks on the house, not out of fear, but because I needed the symbolic closure of knowing this space was truly mine now. I got rid of the bed we had once shared, donating it along with everything else that still carried her scent or her memory. I picked up old hobbies I had abandoned somewhere along the way, things I had let go of to accommodate our relationship or to keep our social calendar moving. I started running again, feeling my body remember what it was like to move with purpose. I read books in perfect silence without waiting for her to fill the room with distractions or complaints about being bored. Sometimes people asked me how I was doing, and I found myself giving them an honest answer. I was healing. It wasn't a linear process, and there were still good days and bitter ones. Sometimes I woke up expecting to hear the sound of her heels clicking across the hardwood floors. Sometimes I dreamed about the version of her I had once known. Soft, wild, kind, full of laughter and possibility. But when I opened my eyes each morning, I was alone. And for the first time in a long time, that didn't feel like loss. It felt like truth, like freedom, like a kind of peace that I didn't have to share with anyone else or justify to someone who might take it away from me at any moment. It had been 4 months since the divorce was finalized, and life now had a quality I could only describe as still. There's no better word for it. Not stagnant, not dull, just still. Like a lake after a storm has passed, calm and clear and reflecting everything honestly. I woke up each morning to a silence that no longer hurt. I made my coffee without subconsciously preparing a second cup out of habit. I walked through this house, my house, without wondering if she might walk through the door unexpectedly, or worse, if he might be with her. The ghost of her presence was finally gone. I could say that with complete honesty now. For a while, I had thought healing would come in some grand, dramatic wave, like I would wake up one morning and feel completely reborn, transformed into someone who had never been hurt. But it wasn't like that at all. Instead, it came slowly through small, seemingly insignificant moments. It came when I walked past her favorite restaurant downtown and realized I didn't feel like I'd been stabbed in the chest. It came when I saw one of her friends at the grocery store and didn't feel the need to duck my head or change aisles to avoid an awkward conversation. It came when I realized I hadn't thought about her for an entire day, then 2 days, then a whole week. I never heard from her again after that final exchange of text messages. There were no "I miss you" messages in the middle of the night, no "I made a terrible mistake" phone calls, no attempts to reconnect or explain herself further. Nothing. And honestly, it was better that way. The silence allowed me to heal without constantly picking at the wound. But something strange and unexpected happened last week that made me realize just how far I'd come. I was cleaning out the attic, trying to reclaim every inch of this space and make it truly mine, when I found an old shoebox tucked behind some Christmas decorations we'd stored up there years ago. Inside the box was a stack of Polaroid photographs, pictures of us from back when love was still unspoken but easy, when everything felt possible and uncomplicated. There we were laughing on the beach during our first vacation together, her head thrown back in genuine joy. There was a blurry shot of our cramped first apartment, cluttered with mismatched furniture and dreams we'd thought would last forever. And on the very bottom of the stack, one photograph I hadn't seen in years. A picture of me holding her hand under a fireworks show, her face tilted up toward mine like I had personally hung every star in the sky just for her. I stared at that photograph for a long time, holding it up to the light and studying our younger faces. We looked so happy, so certain about our future together. For a moment, I felt a familiar ache in my chest, not for her exactly, but for the innocence we'd both lost, for the version of ourselves that had believed love was enough to overcome anything. Then I walked outside to the fire pit in my backyard and dropped the photograph into the flames. I watched it curl and blacken, the edges catching fire first before the whole image disappeared into ash. I wasn't doing it out of hatred or bitterness, I was doing it out of release. Because I finally understood something fundamental that had taken me months to learn. Here's the truth I couldn't see while I was trapped in the middle of that nightmare. Love is not meant to be begged for. Respect is not something you should have to barter or negotiate for like you're haggling at a flea market. And loyalty isn't proven through words or promises. It's proven in silence, in the choices people make when no one is watching, in those invisible moments when character is tested and either passes or fails. She had failed every single one of those tests repeatedly and deliberately. And I had failed myself by waiting so long for her to change, by making excuses for her behavior, by accepting treatment that no person should ever have to accept from someone who claims to love them. But not anymore. Now I went to bed each night with peace instead of suspicion. I had learned to enjoy my own company again, to appreciate the quiet satisfaction of a life lived honestly. I had stopped replaying our final arguments in my head, stopped imagining what I should have said or done differently. I had stopped romanticizing what could have been if only we'd tried harder or communicated better. The simple truth was that some relationships can't be saved, no matter how much effort you pour into them. Some people are determined to destroy what they have, and there's nothing you can do to stop them except save yourself. If you're reading this because you're sitting in that same suffocating silence I once knew so well, wondering if you're overreacting to your partner's behavior, wondering if you're the crazy one, wondering if maybe you deserve to be treated like an afterthought in your own relationship, let me say this to you with absolute certainty. You're not crazy. You're not wrong. And you don't need to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, no matter how much they try to convince you that their comfort is worth your pain. She walked out of my life. I let her go, and the door stayed firmly shut behind her. I survived the ending of everything I thought I wanted, and then slowly, deliberately, I started to build something better. I started to live again, but this time on my own terms.